We're going to talk about beams today. But I want to give you kind of a start to finish explanation of how we achieved this look and why we made some of the decisions that we made. The overall home was framed structurally without these beams. We're standing in a living room that we've essentially faked this gable roof, meaning that this side of the roof actually does not drop down on this angle. That's actually much steeper than this. And this side is actually completely fake, where the front of the home is another 20 feet in that direction. Ultimately, this design was for the interior of the home. These are all solid hemlock, and we ended up with a hemlock because we didn't want to use a pine that was going to have sap, and then eventually, you know, that could continue to dry and even drip down on the finishes. So hemlock was a more stable option. These are solid material because we did not want to do a beam wrap. We wanted this checking. Checking is this cracking in the solid wood. That checking will continue to grow as this wood dries out. The wood is relatively new, so it was really green. Green meaning that it was pretty wet when it was installed. So we brought it on site, we brought it inside, we let it dry out for a while, but we've noticed these cracks have grown over time. They're not going to impact the structural integrity of this. It's very normal for it to dry out and check, especially being so large. It's being 8 inches by 8 inches. There's a lot of material there for it to dry out. What we did know is that being that these are solid, we wanted them to be structurally sound in suspension, meaning that they were being hung from the framing above. So when we were installing these, this rafter here is attached from above. So behind this plaster, we actually anchored down through our framing into the top of the beam rather than going up through the face of it. That prevented us from having to fill anything. So when we actually came back to plaster it, we ran a nice stop bead against this beam here, plastered tight to it, and that way we're not installing these on top of plaster. These are right to the framing. So we actually installed this V-groove in between our beams and landing just on top of each of these beams, but separated. This beam here is installed with a piece of 3/4 inch plywood up against our framing. So as we anchored through the framing and down into the beam, we left a 3/4 inch gap so we could tuck this V-groove into the side of our beam, giving it the appearance that that whole ceiling here is all V-groove. Similar to this here, if you look up, this is all V-groove as well. And then we have our plaster wall extensions that come up, stop bead right against that V-groove. Those are creating those individual light wells for the windows. The windows on the back side, which when you're down in the space and you're looking up at them, they look like they're individual windows that are in dormers, but in fact, it's just the back wall that is then separated by these essentially beams and rafters. I love the way that Teak designed the windows, where he's actually flared out the plaster for those windows. So when you are standing down below, those windows are one size, but essentially the opening in which is on the interior of the wall is much larger, pouring the natural light down into the living room. Once we had our rafters in place, we wanted to then have our cross members and then essentially the post in the middle. Originally, we actually were going to have this in the middle against the fireplace, which is this one here, and then on the exterior wall. A couple of reasons why we swapped that. Number one, you'll see the 2 windows over there that are intercepted by one of the rafters going through the top of the casing. Well, we were gonna end up having that similar issue with the crossbeam going through the glass. That's kind of the intent. You're supposed to have these moments of interruption and kind of giving it that old American look, where an older American home, you kind of work around how the home is built and modified over the course of the years as they renovate the home and add on to the home. You have these kind of quirky moments. We ultimately decided to swap that orientation and put the cross members and the post on these 2 instead. And what that did is actually gave us this opportunity to hang our light from that center one. Prior to closing up the ceiling, our electrician drilled a hole through the center of that, came down throughout it. Prior to installing our light, we'll actually put a block up there so they can put their escutcheon in and then hang the chandelier that will live above the living room. These cross members here are then attached to our rafters. They're actually attached through the face here. If you look, you'll have that curved bracket. If we ignore the curved bracket just for a moment, we've actually anchored up through the cross member into the rafter piece. So those have large structural screws. From there, we have our post. We notch the top to fit within that angle. And you can see here that we have a couple screws here essentially toe-nailing the post right to the cross member. These were definitely friction fit. I remember the guys taking a block and a big sledgehammer getting these in place. All of that is to keep everything nice and tight. And of course, we're using some construction adhesive in all those areas to hold everything together. So last construction detail I want to talk about are these curved brackets. So if you look closely, we have one piece, then we have a seam here, a second piece, and then a seam all the way down there. So we actually cut a template that fit underneath the cross member, down the rafter, and against the face of the plaster wall. And then we took that board and gave it to our CNC shop, and they took this large format timber and they ran it on their CNC router and got us this rough shape. From there, we got them on site, detailed them by hand, made sure that everything was a nice tight fit. And then everything is anchored through the face of it. Now, I mentioned earlier in this video is that all of these beams are tight to the framing, and then we brought our plaster detail to it, or our tongue and groove detail behind it. In this case, for the bracket, we actually land on top of our plaster here. These are a decorative bracket. A couple things that these do, they cover all the holes and screw holes that are in this cross member that attach it to the rafter. And lastly, they kind of bring these down and soften the look of these trusses, beams, rafters, whatever you might want to call them, but essentially bring this cross member, curve it, and bring it down to the face of our plaster. And we have construction adhesive on wood-to-wood surfaces, but we do have some screw holes that did have to get filled, but ultimately very minimal. Lastly, the beams are all stained, so they're stained a medium brown, which I really like because it brings out a lot of the different tannins and different colors within the beams themselves. Being Hemlock, you get a lot of movement in it, and rather than having it be a raw wood, kind of playing off those medium tones that we see throughout the home, such as the oak flooring that's stained, even the walnut cabinetry, you're kind of playing in that medium brown space. So these did get stained last week, so these are considered complete. And then you'll actually see a lot of these Hemlock beams installed on some of the flat ceilings as well. Things like the entryway, dining room, as well as the hallway leading down to the primary suite. We source the same beams from the same vendor and ultimately use very similar details on how to install them. If you want to go back a few videos, I actually show you the actual detail on how we installed that plywood on top to allow the plaster to tuck behind it. Ultimately, it makes for a really authentic look. Now, the original video, you guys talked about, well, if they're not authentic, why install them? I think that's a fair comment. We could have used these as a structural component, but ultimately we were still kind of figuring out what we were going to be using for beams and decided that we were going to build the house structurally sound and then add these as a design element and not rely on this for the structural integrity of the home. One of the arguments I've had since day one is it's similar to installing trim around a window. You could install trim that is one piece, that is square stock, that's very inexpensive, or you could use something nicer like the Kuchen Brothers molding that we've used here. Using Kuchen Brothers molding is strictly an aesthetic decision. It's not structural than anything else being used around a window. So these are the decisions that we're making. It's aesthetic. We are looking for the authentic look by using solid timbers, and that is driven strictly by the aesthetic goals of this home. It's not a more, sorry, I didn't, it's not, sorry. I didn't know, I thought that was John, and I was like, what's John doing?